Well, greetings to all of our campuses. We are so happy to be with you today. Greetings, everybody in King and Clemens and in the heart of the Triad there at Union Cross, and to everybody else joining us by being online with us. So good to be with you. Are you ready for some good news? Yes. You don't have to live in frustration. You can live in compassion. There are a lot of frustrating things that we face in this world. Frustrating people and frustrating systems and frustrating culture. And it can drive you crazy if you don't watch it. But we want today to see a different way. Learning to look at life through the eyes of Jesus, I believe you'll see, quote, sinners in a different way. We're in a new series. It's called You'll See. It's all about praying a simple prayer and saying, Jesus, how do you see this person? How do you see this situation? How do you see all of this? And let the Holy Spirit impart to you fresh vision and perspective, because we are shaped by how we see things. And today we look at a passage in Matthew chapter 9, short passage that says much about how Jesus sees people. Matthew 9, verse 35. And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into this harvest. Well, there was a son who traveled the world. He was an affluent young man, and he liked to time send nice presents back to his mother. And he was in some foreign land and came upon one of the most highly trained parrots in all of the world, a bird that had learned a very extensive vocabulary, and it was a prize. And so he had the bird shipped to his mother. She was a simple woman, lived in a rural area, and she never, knew exactly what to do with some of these fancy gifts that came back. But he contacted her a week later. He said, "Mom, did you get the parrot?" And she said, "Oh, yes." She said, "It was good." She said, "What do you mean it was good?" She said, "I mean, it was delicious." He said, "Mom, you ate the parrot?" She said, "Well, yeah, it was very tasty." He said, "Mother, that bird had been trained with a very extensive vocabulary. Mom, I'm saying that bird could talk." And she said, "Well, he should have said something then." I want to talk to you about how we look upon people that might be frustrating to us. And I think sometimes we look on people and we become exceedingly frustrated with them for not acting like a Christian when they're not a Christian. And sometimes we get frustrated with Christians because they're not acting like Christians. But what we want to see today is that through Jesus' eyes, our frustrations can turn into compassion if you see people rightly. And Jesus was compassionate upon the crowds, not just as a big crowd, but as each individual person within that crowd. He had a compassion on them, and the key to his compassion was in how he saw them. And he saw them, the text said, as sheep without a shepherd. One thing for sure that you will not see unless there's something very badly wrong is a flock of sheep wandering around with no shepherd. Even today in the Middle East, you could see flocks of sheep and shepherds with them, but you don't see sheep just wandering around with no shepherd. Without a shepherd, they are vulnerable and foolish creatures. And it's unthinkable for them not to have a shepherd. And Jesus said this is what moved him to compassion. Let's be honest about it. We get frustrated. We get frustrated in this world. I looked up an online magazine because they had listed the 50 most annoying things that people do. There were some very interesting ones in there. I give you a sample of some of the most annoying things people do, according to one online magazine. Humble bragging, or the backdoor brag. I had to hire a housekeeper because my new house is just too big for me to take care of by myself. You know, sometimes people act like I'm trying to be humble and they're actually bragging. Not holding the door for people behind you, not returning your shopping cart, talking ad nauseum about how busy you are, looking at your phone while talking to someone in person, parking too close to the line in a parking lot, going to an express checkout line at the grocery store with more than 10 items, not letting people get off the elevator before you get on. These are the kinds of things, and I was thinking, well, some of these things I might have done, but this one I definitely have not done. Not wiping down the exercise equipment you use at the gym. I hadn't been doing that, so I hadn't been to the gym. You could add your list. People breaking in line in front of you, an employee being rude to a customer is a particular bother to me. You'd think it's kind of strange that if somebody's listing 50 of the most annoying things, you might list some things a little bit more bothersome, like terrorism, racism, crime, and abuse. In other words, just the whole world is full of things that are frustrating to us. People going in wrong directions, doing the wrong thing, messing up their lives that then messes up the lives of others. And you can think of somebody in your life that's frustrating you, or just the whole culture that's frustrating to you, and you wonder what to do with all of that frustration. I want to give a couple of clarifications before we dive into the meat of this amazing text and this principle that can absolutely change everything in your life. But I want to give some points of clarification, a sort of disclaimer, not really disclaimer, but just clarify something, because in any given sermon, there could be 5 other sermons that are related to it, and we're going to focus on the compassion of Jesus. But I want to be clear that I live and carry with me everywhere a thoroughly biblical worldview, which means that I'm unashamed and unabashed about adhering to the kind of morality and lifestyles and model of the way life was designed by God that is portrayed in the Scripture. And so be assured that whatever I'm saying tonight is not an endorsement of something that is ever unbiblical. That's going to be the farthest thing from my mind. And I also want to say that people, no matter how much compassion we have for people who are in their sin, that people, despite everything I'm going to say tonight about how they're like sheep without a shepherd, people are still responsible for their sin. And that's a little bit of a mystery how we can say both things, but it is certainly true of the Scripture. It is also important to say that to have compassion rather than frustration for people is not an invitation for us to be deceived or duped or scammed or taken advantage of. And it's not to say that we are called to be codependent. Your life does not exist for you to always be feeling responsible for somebody else. I'm not saying any of those things tonight. And so, having said all of that, I want to dive in and talk to you about the compassion of Jesus Christ. Notice that the text says that Jesus went throughout all the cities, verse 35, and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease. Teaching, that is, helping people know the right path, the way of growth, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. That is the announcement of the good news that the kingdom of God has arrived, which makes everything possible, and healing, which is the liberating power of the Spirit through Jesus Christ, healing people emotionally and physically and delivering people from evil. He had, the text said, compassion, verse 36, for them. And the word for compassion is a word that is much stronger in the Greek than the way it comes across in the English. The word for having compassion, splangnidzomai, from the word splungna. Even sounds like what it is, because it refers to the deepest, inmost being, literally the entrails, or what we'd say the guts. It was thought in those times that this is the seat of deepest emotions. Like, and we even say things like down, how do you feel about it down deep in your gut? Right? So the compassion that is being spoken of here is the compassion that runs exceedingly deep. Henry Nouwen, in his book Compassion, has written, compassion is such a deep, central, and powerful emotion in Jesus that it can only be described as a movement of the womb of God. When Jesus was moved to compassion, the source of all life trembled, the ground of all love burst open, and the abyss of God's immense, inexhaustible, and unfathomable tenderness revealed itself. What Nouwen is saying is that when Jesus, the Son of God, the Son of Man, was moved in the splunkna of his being, that there was like an eruption in the cosmos of this inexhaustible love of God that has a relentless force to it. This compassion is something that's constantly referenced of Jesus. Let's look at some of these texts. Matthew's gospel that we read today, and then Mark 6:34. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them. Luke 7, verse 12, as he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and he said to her, do not weep. He would go on to resuscitate the man. Matthew 14, when Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Matthew 20, verse 32, Jesus stopped and called them. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. Lord, they answered, we want our sight. And verse 34 says, Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes, and immediately they received their sight and followed him. Mark chapter 8, verse 1, those days a great crowd gathered, and they had nothing to eat, and he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And of course, John chapter 11, when Jesus saw her weeping, this was at the death of Lazarus. He saw Mary and Martha and others weeping outside the tomb. The Jews who'd come with her also weeping. He was deeply moved in spirit, splangnidzomai, and greatly troubled. He was shaking with emotion of compassion. And he said, where have you laid him? And he's going to raise Lazarus from the grave. Over and over and over, you see it in the New Testament. Jesus heals not just for his own glory or for the validation of his lordship, but what primarily moves him to heal and to help people and to feed people and to teach people is he's moved in his inmost being with compassion. He's moved with a kind of compassion that makes it for him almost irresistible. What was it that caused such a compassion? Look again at verse 36. It says, when he saw the crowds, when he saw them for what was really going on with them, when he saw them for what the real situation was, that's when he had compassion on them. See, so often our frustration is the result of not seeing the person or the situation accurately. I was in a public men's room sometime recently getting ready to wash my hands, and there were two sinks there, and a man came up sort of from behind me and got, I thought, too close to sort of my personal space. Like there's another sink here, and he's kind of encroaching over here. And for just a moment, I just felt that little frustration, like, buddy, what are you doing? Oh. But then I turned and I looked, and he had a cane, he had a stick with him, and I realized he was blind. And so what did I do? Immediately I had compassion, because I have eyes to see, and he was alone and finding his way. And I said, excuse me. And he said, is there another sink on the right? I said, yes. He said, is there a soap dispenser here? I said, yes. And I would have done almost anything to help him. If I hadn't known that, and I just thought, well, why are you getting in my space? You see, I just have frustration. Do you see how quickly frustration can turn into compassion? How possible it is that you could have an entirely different way of seeing a situation. Our church has a ministry that is led by Larry Revis Ministries. We partner with them every year. Luke 14 banquet, which is an opportunity at Christmas time to show love to some of the homeless in our community. Go to various shelters, bring buses, bring anyone that wants to come, and set up as lavish as we can a feast. We put out the china, we put out silverware and glasses. It's not paper. We decorate it as beautifully as we can, and welcome people from the shelters and the local missions to come in and have a Christmas feast one evening each December. And from the time that my kids were little, I loved for them to come and help serve. And I remember one time when Bennett was young and he was coming to serve. I don't know if it was the first time or not, but we went to wash our hands before the meal and then go to serve. And there was one of our guests that was there, one from one of the local shelters, disheveled, old clothes, didn't smell good. And he had his head down over the sink. He was wetting his hair, and he was brushing it back with his hands. And he turned around and looked at us, and he said, if I had known that I was coming to such a nice dinner, I would have tried to get a bath before I had come. But he had arrived, and he'd seen the china and the silverware and the glasses and the servants and the flowers and the decorations and the feast, and he went back to try to straighten himself up a little bit. You see something like that, and it'll change the way you feel. Instead of going, well, why is this guy disheveled? Why is this guy? Maybe it's because he hasn't had any cause or any inward esteem or sense of being valued enough to care about how he looked. You see how quickly your thoughts and your feelings move into compassion if you could see people accurately for what was going on with them. And Jesus had perfect vision. And what he was saying is that the people for whom he had such compassion were like sheep that didn't have a shepherd. And this is a very powerful image because it was a very common sight in those days to just see shepherds going around with their sheep, and everyone knew how vulnerable sheep were if they didn't have a shepherd. Every time that someone's being ordained in our denomination, they are required as part of their examination to preach a sermon in front of the elders from the various churches, what is called presbytery. And I'll never forget the beginning of one of those. The ordinand was preaching from Psalm 23, and he began his introduction with these words: Charles Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest can't be correct for this sole reason: sheep still roam the earth. I thought it was a great line, because do you realize how sheep are just so vulnerable? This image of sheep without a shepherd is not new in the scriptures. Numbers 27:15. Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, "Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep that have no shepherd." Very early image of how desperate a situation it is if people are like sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus applied this to himself in John chapter 10. He said, "I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees a wolf coming, leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them." Matthew 18, Jesus goes even further, says, "What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them's gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go and search the one who went astray?" He's talking about a very common scene, a wayward sheep, and there's no way the sheep's going to be able to find its way back. They're not like bloodhounds that can sniff the ground and find their flock. Once they're lost, they're just lost. Sheep are, it's interesting that this would be such a prevalent image to describe who we are, because sheep are quite foolish and ignorant animals who are stubborn, and basically they will eat and drink the wrong things. Philip Keller, in his book, A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23, describes in his life with sheep and the things he observed. And one of the things he observes is that sheep will stay in the same area grazing because they don't know how to go find another green pasture, and they'll just keep there until they'll paw up the roots until the grass is completely gone and won't even grow anymore. And the reason it's important for a shepherd to lead the sheep by the still waters is to say that a shepherd has to lead a sheep on to places where there is pure water, because sheep don't know any better, and they'll get into a little pool or something and they'll foul it with their own waste until it's polluted water, and they'll be drinking it. Sheep eat the wrong things and drink the wrong things. They don't know how to get nourished. And sheep are amazingly vulnerable. They don't have any self-defense. There are not many animals like this that just you can't point to some defense that they have. Maybe they can be camouflaged. Maybe some animals have sharp teeth, and maybe some can inflate themselves to look scary. Maybe some can run fast to get away from predators. Some have big claws. Some have strength and can leap, and sheep can't do any of it. Sheep, it reminds me of the vulnerability, about the same vulnerability as a guinea pig. And this is a sore spot for me, because I had guinea pigs when I was a kid, and it's happened twice. Fluff 1 and Fluff 2. I'm scarred by this. Took Fluff 1 out in the front yard just for a few moments to let Fluff 1 roam free and eat some grass. And a dachshund, a weenie dog. Nobody had fences or leashes back in that day. Came down and pounced on Fluff 1, and that was the end of Fluff 1. You'd have thought we'd learn from that, but sometime later we had Fluff 2 out in the front yard. And by a terrible, horrible coincidence, same dachshund comes, pounces on Fluff too. I got 2 of them down by these dogs. If you wonder why I don't like dachshunds, it's because of that. Let me just tell you the irony of this was when I fell in love with my wife and we were sharing stories. I said, well, do y'all have a dog? She says, yeah, we got a dachshund. I said, oh, my word, are you kidding me? She said, yeah, he's fun. She said, the only problem is one time the neighbor had their guinea pig out in the front yard and our dog. I said, are you kidding me right now? Think of a guinea pig. What are they going to do to defend themselves against a dachshund? That's about the way that a sheep has in trying to defend itself against a mountain lion or a coyote or a bear or any other predator that might come upon it. The sheep has no defense. It's a guinea pig. The sheep are also so foolish that they will follow one another into dangerous places. Philip Keller said that some of them have been known to just follow one another off a cliff. I remember one time when I was in high school, I didn't go to many parties. I thought they were dumb, but I was at this party and it's just boring, I thought, and I was with a couple of my friends, and I have no idea. It was a big crowded party in somebody's house. I had no idea why, but somebody had some electrical tape. It must have been sitting on a shelf there and pulled a piece off and was tickering around with it, and a piece actually got stuck on his nose. And we said, you got a piece of tape on your nose? He said, oh, okay, so, I might just leave it on there. And we just had this idea. We said, let's all put a piece of tape on our nose. So we got about 4 of us, and we put a piece of black electrical tape on our nose. A small piece of black electrical tape on our nose. Started wandering around the party. And people say, why do you have a piece of black tape on your nose? And we say, well, that's everybody else doing it. I'm telling you the truth. Within about 40 minutes, the vast majority of people at this party were walking around with a piece of black electrical tape on their nose. We are astounding how much we will conform to what we see others doing. Sheep will just follow each other into the wrong places. They will keep walking, Philip Keller says, in the paths that they make deep ruts that they can't get out of. They sometimes, Keller said, a sheep will get stuck on its back. It's called a cast sheep. What will happen is they're down, they get comfortable, and then they kind of roll a little bit, and their weight shifts, and the legs go up like this. And the sheep cannot get back up. And a sheep like that is in jeopardy, especially if it's in the hot sun, because of the way the gases build up inside the belly of the sheep, and a sheep can die like that. And it has to have, it can't get up. The shepherd has to find it, get it right back up, rub its legs, get the blood going again, and get the sheep on its way. It is interesting that the word for harassed, he saw them like sheep harassed, is really to be like attacked or torn. And the word for helpless comes from the Greek word that means to throw down. Helpless comes from the word it means throw down, like when Judas went and threw down the silver coins. It probably, I'm having to guess a little bit this, but it probably therefore arouses in Jesus' mind the image of a sheep that's been cast, that's fallen down, is cast down, and can't get back up. That Jesus saw the crowds, and it was like they were being attacked by the wolf, and it was like they were stuck and they couldn't get themselves back up. That's the way he saw the people. And for this reason, he felt compassion. All of this is to say that like sheep, we cannot find our own way without a shepherd. And therefore, the identity of the sheep is rooted in the shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. As if to say, the Lord's my shepherd. Yahweh is my shepherd. Who's yours? In other words, the sheep is identified by the flock. My sheep know my voice, Jesus said. Now, this is a completely countercultural thing to say and could be offensive to some, but it clearly is the biblical picture, and that is that we don't find our identity by looking within ourselves. We find our identity by our shepherd who leads us. And it is to say that we don't find victory by looking inside ourselves. In other words, it's impossible for sheep to not act foolishly if they don't have a shepherd. They will not find green grass. They will not drink pure water. They will not be able to fight off the wolf. They will not be able to get themselves back upright if they're cast. It's just not in their nature. And you can't take a sheep and say, I want to train you to be a better fighter, or I'm going to show you how there's a little stunt you can do to get yourself back on your own feet if you're cast down. You can't take them to the gym and say, we're going to do some core training so you'll be able to jump higher, and we're going to do some track and field so you can learn to run faster. You can't. A sheep is a sheep, and the sheep cannot have victory without a shepherd. Just can't. It's because of this, of seeing people for how helpless they are, how harassed they are by the devil, how hopeless they are without a shepherd. It is in that way that Jesus saw people and he had compassion for them. Compassion of Christ moves him to heal you. The compassion of Christ moved him to die for you. The compassion of Christ causes him to be patient with you. God loves this world that is so frustrating. The problem, Nouwen said in his book on compassion, is that the spirit of competition is warring against compassion. It is to say that God can be perfectly compassionate because he's not in competition with anybody. Listen to the way Nouwen puts it. Therefore, only God can be wholly compassionate because only God is not in competition with us. The paradox of God's compassion is that God can be compassionate because God is wholly other than we are. Because God is wholly other, God can be holy as we are. God can become so deeply human because he is so fully divine. In short, God can be fully compassionate because there can be no comparison with us, and thus God is in no way in competition with us. I love that. In other words, what it means is that in life, if like we got this spirit of competition, we got to get ahead of somebody to prove ourselves. And the only way you could have perfect compassion for somebody is when you don't have any need to prove yourself or get ahead of them. It's sort of like a loving father's compassion for his toddler. You're helping a toddler learn to walk because you're not in a competition of walking with your toddler. You already can walk. You already can run. You know so much more than your toddler. There's no competition. You're not having to prove anything, so you're free only to have mercy flowing towards the one who is in need. Competition wars against compassion. This is why I can't watch games with my wife when my team is winning, because once they start winning by a lot, she starts feeling sorry for the other team, and I have to kick her out of the room and say, no, we have to run the score up as high as we can. But the compassion is competing with competition spirit itself, and God is God all by himself. Jesus is fully free to have mercy and love, perfect love, because he has no other need. He is God. In other words, instead of just being frustrated with people, stop and say, Jesus, how do you see them? It's not an invitation to excuse sin. It's not an invitation to become overly responsible for other people. It's not an invitation to endorse the confused way of the world. Not at all. But it is to say, you read the New Testament, you see Jesus being angry and frustrated with religiosity, people that would try to take his name and take the word and misuse it to bear heavy weight on people. But what you didn't see was him being frustrated with the confused masses of people who were going in wrong directions, even though there was rampant immorality everywhere around him. Why? Why are people the way they are? Pause and just ask, well, instead of just becoming frustrated, pause and say, why is this person this way? Why are these people this way? Why is our culture this way? How in the world are we going to expect sheep to act as though they're not sheep? They are sheep, and the only answer is that they have a shepherd. And that's why Jesus says, just pray that there'll be more laborers, because the harvest, the numbers of people that are going to discover the love of a good shepherd, that number is enormous, and we need a lot more people praying. We need a lot more people going. We need a lot more people who, instead of condemning the world, are going to want to partner with God in his saving mercy. Wow. It's the heart of God. When Bennett was 1, we were visiting Ann's parents, and Bennett was fussing all night long. We had just led him through a time of learning to sleep through the night, because he was just one of those babies that would cry in the night, and then when he would get him, we'd feed him a little bit and hold him and cuddle him, and we finally got him where he'd sleeping through the night. And then he had a night where he is just crying in the night, and we're trying to calm him down, pat him, and I was just feeling frustrated with the baby, like, you've learned to sleep through the night, now just get over this. The next day, he was still fussy, and with something very odd, he didn't want to eat. And I said, well, that's not good. And so we went to the doctor. It was the same pediatrician that Ann had when she was growing up. We were in Winston-Salem visiting, and we went to the doctor, and he looked in little Bennett's ear and said, oh boy, got a big raging ear infection in here. I about burst into tears because I was being frustrated with my boy, and he had a sickness. He was sick. He had an earache. No wonder he was fussing so much. It was a terrible feeling. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, Bennett. Oh, and all of a sudden, everything within us wanted to just love and help him, right? The world has got a lot of sickness in it. And it's not just cancers and infections and viruses. Soul sick. And Jesus invites us to see it rightly and to know his compassion. For when you have that kind of compassion, it changes every thought, every feeling, and every one of our behaviors. You can also see people like sheep without a shepherd, and it'll change everything in your heart. You'll see. And that's the gospel.